to speak at inviting me to speak at this EURA Conference. And I want to particularly thank Susanna for proposing my book, Cities in the Urban Age, and its argument about contradictions is the theme of the conference. I'm grateful to her and I'm flattered to be so honored. With that, let me begin. Okay, at least 6 decades ago, a small number has passed since a small number of scholars broke away from the traditional academic disciplines to focus their attention on the city. They had two motivations. One was the belief that the city was too complex to be thinly sliced along economic, anthropological, or political contours. Doing so would leave unaddressed much of what makes a city. Doing so would suppress the very richness that makes the city such a compelling object of study. Only a multi or transdisciplinary approach can do the city justice. The other motivation was the belief that the traditional disciplines were indifferent to the plight of cities. They were too committed to an objectivity that confined research to questions of little relevance for what was needed to make cities and life in cities better. Required was a normative approach that could provide knowledge useful for policymakers. These two motivations gave rise to the field of urban studies. In my lecture today, I'll focus on the latter motivation, what I'm calling the impulse to action. To a great extent, the research done and the writings produced by urban scholars are ultimately and often explicitly directed at mobilizing informed and purposive responses to problematic urban conditions. Research conducted on the impact of immigrants on the retail districts of inner city neighborhoods, on the housing market effects of short-term rental platforms, or on the contribution that industry-based green building certification makes to carbon reduction is not simply done out of intellectual curiosity. The intent is to understand how cities work and how people and organizations function within them, and then to treat this knowledge as the basis for actions that address current public concerns. And while urban studies, like all scholarly endeavors, turns inward in order to develop itself as a field, its core justification turns outward to individual and collective action. Informed and purposive change is inherent to urban scholarship, and the impulse to action is one of its defining characteristics. The impulse to action is about improvement. A singular moment is the progress that society makes in attending to existing urban problems, as well as beckoning opportunities. For this reason, we need a sense of how what we propose can be translated into purposive actions and how these actions can accumulate to change the trajectory of cities and alter their future. Consequently, when we write up the results of our research, we often point to the kinds of decisions and initiatives that make sense. At times, we even make policy recommendations. How, though, do we imagine this informed sense of what needs to be done actually being done? What are the possible outcomes of the change that we envision? If people and organizations take our advice, what can we expect to happen? And how might we think about these questions and how they influence how we do urban studies? In my recent book, Cities in the Urban Age of Dissent, I proposed that cities could be best understood as places of concentrated contradictions in which tensions exist between opposing forces. These tensions are both irreconcilable and irresolvable. Cities contain contradictions not as temporary deviations from an ideal state, but as a condition of their existence. This perspective points to a particular understanding of the possibilities of informed and purposive change, and thus to the conduct of urban research. Now, I'm going to use this argument about contradictions, along with a counter-argument, what I'll call the urban age thesis, to reflect on the impulse to action and how it's connected to notions of progress. In the end, we want progress. We want movement to a more desirable direction. Progress, though, can be interpreted in many different ways, and it thus offers us different understandings of the possibility for informed change. My objective is to encourage you to think more deeply about how change occurs, what we can expect from the impulse to action, and how our research and writings might take this into account. To begin, however, I'm going to jump ahead in my story and reflect briefly on why the impulse to action might not be as desirable as we seem to believe. It's always useful to question, to unsettle our assumptions. And one such assumption in need of critical reflection is that informed and purposive change is of indisputable value. Now, to help with this unsettling, I'm going to call on Albert O. Hirschman, one of the most famous political economists of the mid-20th century. At one point in his illustrious career, Hirschman became bothered by arguments being mounted against the post-war welfare state. He grouped these counter-arguments under the rubric of the rhetoric of reaction. In his book of the same name, Hirschman wrote, quote, "My emphasis will thus be on the major polemical postures and maneuvers likely to be engaged in by those who set out to debunk and overturn progressive policies and movements of ideas." He focused on three reactionary theses: the thesis of perversity, the thesis of futility, and the thesis of jeopardy. In the perversity thesis, the claim is that any attempt at improvement will produce unintended consequences in opposition to and undermining the goals being pursued. Let me give you an example. In the United States, a debate exists between those who support citing affordable and subsidized housing in low-income neighborhoods where it is most needed, and those who propose citing it in affluent neighborhoods where low-income households would have better access to public and private services and to a more favorable social environment. The latter group argues that providing affordable housing in low-income urban neighborhoods will, by eliminating blighted conditions, make those neighborhoods more desirable to gentrifiers, thereby inflating housing costs. Instead of making life better for low-income households, existing residents in non-subsidized housing end up displaced, paying more for rent than they can afford, while living in neighborhoods antithetical to their values and way of life. The consequences of this affordable housing policy, the thesis claims, are perverse. Second is the futility thesis. Here, quoting Hirschman again, the futility thesis argues that, quote, any alleged change is or will be largely surface facade, cosmetic, hence illusory, as the deep structures of society remain wholly untouched, unquote. This criticism should be familiar. It's frequently launched against reformers by the more radical of urban scholars. Consider as an example a policy of the New York City government that makes the construction of new affordable housing contingent on the construction of market rate housing. To increase the supply of affordable housing, the city government requires that developers include below market rate rental units in their market rate projects. In exchange, the developers receive a density bonus that enables them to build more units than currently allowed. In effect, affordable housing is only built where and when private developers deem it appropriate. The basic structure of capitalism, a structure that fails to provide affordable housing on its own, remains intact. According to this thesis, the policy is futile. for the core dynamics of the housing market are left unchanged. Lastly, the third thesis, that based on jeopardy. This is a bit more complicated. It basically claims that any attempt at informed and purposive change threatens previous accomplishments as well as ongoing initiatives. Public policies are not isolated from each other. The change being proposed might well be desirable, but it runs the risk of creating unacceptable consequences for other initiatives. Staying with the example of affordable housing, building affordable housing in low-income neighborhoods keeps low-income households subject to conditions that block their advancement. These households would be better off in neighborhoods with a greater range of educational, social, and employment opportunities. Thus, by pursuing the affordable housing goal, we jeopardize the goal of upward mobility. Now, these arguments undermine the impulse to action, and I think we have to reject them. To embrace them would not only be debilitating, but also remove one of the motivations for urban studies. Implied by each thesis is that purpose of change has to be pure in its consequences in order to be acceptable. In effect, the ideal becomes the enemy of the good. And yet, we need to acknowledge that each of these theses contains an important truth. Solutions often do have unintended and undesirable consequences. Reform frequently leaves underlying dynamics structured in place, and our initiatives are frequently interconnected. This does not mean, though, that one should not and cannot act in informed and purposive ways and achieve a degree of success. That individual and collective actions are not panaceas is obvious, but inaction in the face of problems and opportunities is unacceptable on many levels. Now, some of you might point out, and you would be justified in doing so, that the rhetoric of reaction is not absent from the urban literature. What are we to make of a journal article that accuses a state-based inner-city slum redevelopment project of ignoring the needs of residents while facilitating capital accumulation? Or a study that points out how urban gentrification and densification exacerbate neighborhood tensions? Or, as a third example, of research that notes how the acquisition of rural land by agribusiness and shopping mall developers causes displacement, diminishes the ranks of small farmers, and depletes urban space. Are these not reactions against informed and purposive change? For many people, slum development, gentrification, and the spatial expansion of the urban economy are beneficial developments. For them, this is progress, and opposition to them is reactionary. Of course, there's an obvious rejoinder to this characterization, one that Hirschman used. He confined his investigation to arguments against what he termed progressive policies and movements of ideas. With the word progressive meant to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable forms of change. But this is a bit of an evasion on his part. Who is to decide what is progressive? Change and reaction to change are always a matter of perspective and always a matter of politics. What, though, about the impulse to action itself? How might we think of this impulse and about the informed and purposive change to which urban scholarship ostensibly leads? One answer to this question begins with my argument about the contradictory nature of cities. That argument and its counter-argument give rise to two incommensurable notions of progress and to different ways of conceiving of the prospects of progressive change. The argument in cities in the urban age is based on the premise that when people live in close proximity, conflicts amongst them are unavoidable. Ethnic and religious groups, businesses, governments, voluntary associations, nonprofit organizations, and advocacy groups are in competition for space and resources with each other and with nature. Consequently, the city serves multiple interests, virtues, vices, and passions, and pits diverse publics in opposition to each other. These oppositions or contradictions emanate from society, but they are concentrated in cities. Intrinsic to cities, they cannot be eliminated. They're not negations in the sense that opposing forces cancel each other, rather they are constituted. One force gives rise to the other, even as it opposes it. Four contradictions strike me as characteristic of contemporary cities: that between wealth and poverty, between environmental destruction and environmental sustainability, between oligarchy and democracy, and between intolerance and tolerance. First, although cities make great wealth possible, they also concentrate that wealth in the hands of a few individuals, families, and corporations, thereby leading to disparities in income and wealth, and contributing to relative poverty, inequalities of income, and inequalities of wealth. They're all unavoidable. Second, cities are one of the most environmentally destructive forms of human settlement, but also hold out the best hope for environmental sustainability. Consider, for example, the claim that density, a source of environmental problems, offers a path to minimizing the consequences of climate change. Third, although cities are ideal places for democracy to thrive, they enable political influence to be concentrated among a few people in ways that displace and weaken democracy. Cities facilitate concentrations of power, even as they provide the conditions for sharing that power. Fourth and lastly, while cities encourage people to be tolerant so as to allow the benefits of agglomeration and social diversity to be realized, they also nurture contempt, fears, antagonism, indifference, and violence that lead to intolerance. Now, in order to position my argument about contradictions in current debates within urban studies, I began the book with a discussion of what I and others call the urban age thesis, a celebration of cities that draws much of its attention, draws much of its energy from an observation contained in a 2007 United Nations State of the Population report. The first sentence of that report has become one of the most cited in urban studies over the last decade. It reads as follows. In 2008, for the first time, more than half of the world's population living in urban areas. This stylized fact is a key theoretical, rhetorical, and empirical moment in the urban age thesis. Its proponents consider this ostensible demographic milestone to be a major achievement that represents not just the emergence of a new way of life for most of the world's residents, but the emergence of numerous possibilities for rethinking political and economic arrangements at the global scale. We live in a new urban era where the city is the center of the human society, the driving force of national and global economies, the source of creativity that engenders unlimited prosperity, the site of environmental innovations on which sustainability will be built, and the place where diverse cultures will come together in vibrant and tolerant public realms. And although the cities still suffer from inequalities and political fragmentations, these conditions, according to the urban age thesis, are mere vestiges of an earlier era that can be overcome by recognizing the great potential of cities. If the urban age has not yet fully arrived, we are in imminent transition to its realization. While there's much of value in this thesis of an emergent urban age, it harbors a particular understanding of how cities can change, and thus about their fate. And this understanding is incompatible with my argument about urban contradictions. What underpins the urban age perspective is a commitment to a notion of change and an understanding of progress that I reject. Its proponents imply that cities have reached their full potential and any lingering social and economic problems can be more than adequately addressed by the capacity for innovation and technologically informed management that define urban age cities. Cities now are the source of solutions to the problems that they previously created, and to the problems of human society more generally: global warming, national growth, immigration, economic inequalities, global finance, and even authoritarianism, All can be addressed by creativity and appropriate technologies that make ideological positions irrelevant as prosperity becomes the norm and inequalities diminish. In short, cities are triumphant, with their ascendancy marking the end of progress. Progress has been exhausted and creative cities are the result. This is what I call teleological progress, that is movement not just to a desirable state, but to an ideal end state. Some years ago, the cultural theorist Frederick Jameson, commenting on climate change, wrote that, quote, "Someone once said that it is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism." In light of the urban age thesis, I propose that we revise Jameson's observation. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of cities. No human achievement so perfect, so resilient, so immutable in its essence can possibly end. By contrast, if one accepts, as I do, that cities are beset by contradictions that cannot be resolved and only rebalanced or dampened, then one has to accept that urban problems, poverty, labor exploitation, religious intolerance, political corruption, are stubbornly persistent. None of these problems will ever be fully eliminated. Poverty will not be eradicated. Corruption can be punished and restrained, but not made to disappear. Intolerance will always be part of our daily lives. There is no ideal city at the end of the long road of history, as the urban age thesis implies. All that we can do with our informed and purposive interventions is to strike a different balance. And although this seems pessimistic and to preclude any revolutionary change, the more important implication here is that reform matters. Improvement is possible, and we should consider this progress. To this extent, we don't have to think of progress only as teleological, such that the movement of humanist civilization is toward an ideal future. Consider the notion of improvement that I just mentioned. From this perspective, we can think of progress as being reparative, that is, as repairing damage that previously has been done. Such progress looks towards the wrongs of the past and to the present conditions that have resulted, and not to the hopeful potentialities of an idealized future, as with teleological progress. In reparative progress, we measure progress in terms of the extent to which present problems have been minimized. The goal is not a just city, but a less unjust city, not a sustainable city, but a less environmentally destructive city, not a fully tolerant city, but a less intolerant one. Where this might lead is of less concern than achieving the possible. The goal is to make life better for the people who live in cities, in effect to make cities better. People are not being asked to wait for a promise to be realized, a perfect world to appear. Rather, the expectation is that current conditions will be improved and amends will be made for past deeds. This notion of reparative progress corresponds to my argument about the contradictory nature of cities. If the city is rife with contradictions, and if they cannot be eliminated, then the goal is to minimize, dampen, and suppress injustices and the undesirable conditions to which they give rise. The goal is not to aim fruitlessly for a world in which contradictions do not exist. There is simply no self-regulating, equilibrium-seeking world bending towards the inherent goodness of humanity. In effect, we have two different ways of thinking about the fate of cities. One, the urban age thesis, situates that fate in a particular type of economic, social, political, and spatial formation that has already arrived, at least embryonically, or will soon triumph through its own accord. The other, that based on contradictions and reparative progress, considers the fate of cities to be a matter of never-ending improvement. Moreover, since this latter perspective is agnostic as regards the end state of historical change, it never expects to resolve either into a particular type of city or even cities themselves. In fact, It leaves open the possibilities that cities are not eternal, not the final destination of human settlement, and that with innumerable changes in the ways we live with each other and live and on the earth and with other living things, we might arise different novel types of human places. Cities as we know them might well disappear. I don't mean to signal with this comment a capitulation to another common argument about the fate of cities, that cities are inexorably fated to decline to insignificance. Whether one argues from the inevitability of ever-increasing negative externalities, the entropic nature of all human arrangements, our human tendencies towards corruption and violence, the decline prediction is that cities at some point in time will become uninhabitable and obsolete. And although this seems to echo my argument about contradictions reparative progress, at least as regards the potential for successive improvements to create new types of human settlements, it differs from it in an important way. Whereas the argument from decline posits that the negative aspects of urban conditions and contradictions will inevitably triumph, I see the positive aspects of contradictions never wholly succumbing to the negative aspects. And with the opposite true as well. The negative aspects are never fully overwhelmed by the positive. Behind these different arguments, in fact, providing the foundation for them, is the notion that reality does not come to us already interpreted, already infused with meaning. The political theorist Lisa Dish captured this thought. She wrote that, quote, no phenomenon simply gives rise to its categories of analysis, unquote. Rather, we have to make sense of reality. We have to supply its meaning. As regards the fate of cities, multiple interpretations can be imagined and defended, even after we account for facts that often befuddle our categories and circumscribe our interpretations. The idea that reality comes to us already interpreted, already conceptually packaged for our consumption, does not come to us already interpreted, already conceptually packaged for our consumption, is also shared by the UCL planning professor Vaughn Wright. In her forthcoming book, Theory and Planning Research, she writes that research is more robust, more generalizable, and just more interesting when it is framed theoretically. Ben perceives, in line with Dish's premise, to offer 7 theoretical approaches to planning research that range from rational choice theory and new institutionalism to political economy, Foucauldian governmentality, and relational theories that draw on social materiality and assemblage thinking. As I read her book, Wyden is arguing that we have a choice in the ontological perspective that we bring to urban research. No single perspective is to be preferred. More than one approach can be deemed theoretically sound, empirically supportable, and practically useful. And although some theories might prove to be unsatisfactory, no theory has the privilege of being presumptively superior. This is not relativism gone wild. Rather, it's an acknowledgement of the human and the unavoidable subjective perspective of all scholarship. We make choices because the facts do not. Wyden's argument leads us to an important point about the different levels of abstraction involved in all social research. The theories that Wyden offers, what might be called mid-range theories, that is, theories that reflect on how people interact on a daily basis, forming organizations and businesses, deciding where and how to live, and exerting power or succumbing to it. These theories work in the present and in the foreground. In cities in the urban age, my concern, by contrast, is with the deep time of cities rather than their day-to-day activities. My interest is in the background, or better, the ontological assumptions in which mid-range theories are constructed. What we know and believe about cities is a product of different layers of empirical and theoretical understandings. To put this in a different register of intersecting epistemological and ontological positions. Consider a simplified version of this, one that involves layers of theoretical abstraction. In the top layer, we find scholars approaching their research by asking what the data say. The work is guided by a commitment to empiricism, such that evidence is seen as isomorphic with reality, as well as transparent, that is obvious in its meaning. Research is disengaged from any theoretical framing or commitment. Theory seems to be absent. The evidence is preeminent, and the research proceeds on the basis of what reasonable people would surmise from the evidence at hand. This type of research and writing is quite common in urban studies and policy analysis. However, I was careful to say that theory seems to be absent, rather than that theory is absent. Theory is there. In fact, it is just hidden. Though often theoretically informed, the author has chosen to shift attention to the data and to give the impression that the data are speaking to themselves. The implication is that the researcher has not inserted himself or herself between the evidence and the interpretation of that evidence. Such claims, however, are also anchored in a particular way of thinking about rational behavior and how reasonable people would interpret the world. To this extent, it has roots in neoclassical economics, various social theories related to functionalism, and political theories such as rational choice and intergroup pluralism. Here lies the hidden theory. Now, although this level of urban scholarship has adequate qualities, it marginalizes or even ignores the premise that phenomena do not come to us already interpreted, already stocked with meaning. When people claim to read the evidence in an unmediated fashion, they reject this premise. And the research runs the risk of drifting into what I might diplomatically label lightly mediated empiricism. Below this top level, deeper into the ontological depths, is an approach to urban scholarship that believes that all research has to be theoretically framed. This is ego and writing. Lacking a theoretical point of view, we don't know whether what we are observing is or is not a matter of concern and thus to be addressed, or even what qualifies as evidence. Absent theory, how to properly analyze the evidence, and what the subsequent findings might mean will elude us. In the top layer, urban scholars seem to operate without theory. In the next layer down, they are explicit about the theoretical perspective they bring to the research and to how it has informed and guided the research and their interpretation of the evidence. This is Ryden's project, to encourage us to recognize not just the benefits of, but the necessity of theoretical framing. There's another level under this, the level where my argument about the contradictory nature of cities resides. Every theoretical frame that Ryden considers, and others not mentioned, rests on a layer of ontological assumptions about how the world is organized and functions, and thus about the possibilities for certain types of change, not others. Social theories require assumptions. They require assumptions about human behavior and about how humans interact with nature. These assumptions are what enable theory to be presumptively credible. One first assumes that people have inherent interests related to their social position and that they make decisions based on those interests, and only then does intergroup political theory make sense. But if the assumptions are suspect, then the theory collapses. My argument about the contradictions is an attempt to stipulate basic assumptions that occupy this third and deeper level of abstraction. Collective human behavior generates contradictory impulses that are both unavoidable and irreconcilable. Any mid-range theory that we adopt has to be seen in relationship to these assumptions. This is not to claim that contradictions contradict the truth, and the only foundation on which to build theories in urban studies. For many urban scholars, the urban age thesis is a more than credible argument. In fact, to claim either one as the truth would violate the very premise on which I have based this argument. That said, I have great difficulty believing that the world is not contradictory. The historical record seems clear, and to ignore what seems to be overwhelming evidence strikes me as willful delusion. What I am suggesting is that urban studies scholarship benefits not only from being theoretically informed in the mid-range, as Ryden proposes, but also by operating at an even deeper level, My preferred deeper level is the argument that we live in a world saturated with contradictory tendencies. The cities as those places and arrangements that concentrate and exacerbate those contradictions. Not to take this into account is to reflect much too little on the informed and purpose of change, the impulse to action that motivates urban scholarship. Any effort to intervene in the workings of the world carries with it assumptions about human behavior and human-environment relations. Ignoring these assumptions or acknowledging them in only an uncritical way diminishes the value of our scholarship. Such assumptions do not need to be explicitly acknowledged in everything that we do, but they at least have to be settled into our consciousness, and thus part of the tacit knowledge that guides our work. If we want urban research to change cities for the better, we want to bring to the surface the impulse to action that underpins urban scholarship. If we want to engage reparative progress, we have to understand not just how change is possible, but what change is possible. And most importantly, we have to make that understanding central and indispensable to our work. Thank you.